Good day. Today is Sunday, 20th July 2025. In my previous video, I began with a brief summary of the military situation in Ukraine, and without apologies, I'm going to do the same today because I get the clear sense that we're in the middle now of a major battle, perhaps what will turn out to be the most consequential battle of the war, as the Russian offensive intensifies and starts to batter down what I suspect are going to prove Ukraine's last significant defences in Donbass. And here I would go first to the topic of the fight for Pokrovsk. This is currently the main battle, and we are getting reports that the situation for the Ukrainians has deteriorated further over the last 24 hours, though it continues to be extremely difficult to get precise information because of the careful control of information that both sides have imposed as they struggle for advantage in this particular battle. Anyway, apparently video has appeared which shows the village of Rodynska north of Pokrovsk. It's perhaps more a small town or a very big village than just a village. But anyway, this village of Rodynska, on the main road leading into Pokrovsk from the north, there are pictures apparently which show it being very heavily shelled and bombed by the Russian military. It seems that the Russian military are just outside, and the universal assumption is that this extremely heavy shelling and bombing is preparatory to an attack, a storming operation against this village itself. Now, when exactly that will happen, some are speculating at some point within the next 5 days. Well, I, of course, don't know. I'm not in touch with anybody who's on the battlefronts. I'm not there myself, so I'm not able to say. Nor do I know what exactly is the situation in the mine, the Krasny Liman mine, which is located just to the southeast of Rodynska. But the fact that the shelling of Rodynska itself is so intense, and the reports that the Russians are just outside Rodynska, all of that suggests to me that there's probably heavy fighting going on in the mine, in the area of the mine, and that the Russians are probably in the process of storming it. There's also no precise word of what's happening in Novoekonomichne, a village which is actually located somewhat to the southeast of these two places, the mine and Rodynska itself. But there are reports circulating, there are claims that the Russians control around half of Novoekonomichne, and that the garrison, the Ukrainian garrison that is located there, is in effect surrounded. Again, no actual precise detailed confirmation, but there is very little information that contradicts this story, and one gets the sense that the pressure on the Ukrainians northeast of Pokrovsk is intensifying by the hour. Probably the Russians have to work hard to build up the logistics in this area. They control various villages to the south of the main road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinyvka, this road that was so much talked about for such a long time. But the key event was the capture some weeks ago of Vozvyzhenka and then of Mirolyubivka, which were located to the south of the road. And the Russians have pushed north towards the road in several places. They've crossed the road in several places. They've gained control of villages to the east of Pokrovsk, villages like Shevchenko Pershe, Koptyevo, Mirnie, Razinye, Fyodorivka, Sukhetske, apparently. All of these places, located apparently on high ground, are now under Russian control. And the Russians are using both the topography and their forces to launch these attacks. And my guess is that they're probably moving, transferring men and machines closer to the contact line. They're probably rotating the assault troops, and they're sorting out the logistics in advance of what I suspect will be the attack on Rodynska itself. It seems to me that if Rodynska and the coal mine are captured, then Novoekonomichny, whatever Ukrainian troops are still there, are going to find themselves in an impossible position. Anyway, that is the situation to the northeast of Pokrovsk. This is an unusual battle in that it has been conducted with similar levels of intensity to the southwest and south of Pokrovsk. It's fairly clear that the Russians are indeed, they've broken into what you might call this Pokrovsk agglomeration, conurbation from the south as well. I suspect this happened some weeks ago. There's said to be heavy fighting underway for control of a village called Zverove, which is located to the southwest of Pokrovsk, and also another village, Leonardivka, which is also slightly closer to the center of Pokrovsk than Zverove is. And, well, there haven't been any reports from Udachny, which is also in this general area, somewhat to the southwest, but I get the sense that there's intense fighting in that area too. That village, Udachny, is apparently now in pincers. It could very well be that at any point in time we could get a report which confirms that the Russians are in full control of Udachny. For all I know, they might even be so as of the time when I make this program. So, a rapidly deteriorating situation for the Ukrainians around Pokrovsk, and all of the reports speak, as I spoke yesterday in my program, of tired Ukrainian soldiers, exhausted, lacking supplies, increasingly demoralized, pinned down in various places. The fighting in southern Pokrovsk makes it more difficult for them to relocate troops to hold off the Russians in the northeast, where perhaps the greater danger is coming from. And anyway, a climactic battle which is in some respects different from the other battles we have seen play out in the period of the special military operation. There have, of course, been sieges, other sieges of other places. The Russians captured Mariupol and the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk conurbation fairly early on in the conflict in the summer of 2022. But these were head-on attacks on these two cities. In the case of Mariupol, the Russians did cut it off from resupply. They established the cauldron there, but nothing quite as complex as the battle that is currently playing out around Pokrovsk. And if we're talking about Bakhmut, again, this was more like a head-on attack on Bakhmut by Prigozhin and his Wagner forces. In fact, there was apparently some controversy that Prigozhin led the Wagner forces into Bakhmut before all the supply roads had been fully cut. And in terms of Avdiivka, the Russians stormed Avdiivka without fully cutting the supply roads. They did carry out attacks on the supply roads in advance of the storming of Avdiivka, but it is clear that this is more an operation to pin down the Ukrainians than what we're seeing playing out in Pokrovsk as well. And there have been, of course, other battles involving the storming of other cities, Selidovo, Kurachovo, Novokrainka, all of these places, but nothing quite on the scale of what is playing out in Pokrovsk at the moment. So we'll see what happens. Perhaps we should correct that. We should see how long this takes. But the battle is very intense. And I would say that it's, from a Russian point of view, probably fulfilling two objectives at the same time. As with the Battle of Bakhmut, obviously the Russians do want to capture this place. Pokrovsk is a vital communications node. It will simplify Russian communications and logistics, as, by the way, the capture of Bakhmut eventually did. It will, even more than was the case with Bakhmut, open the way for the Russians to attack other places, to outflank the Ukrainians in Konstantinyvka, Slavyansk, and Kramatorsk, and also to advance west towards the Dnieper. But at the same time, it also undoubtedly serves the policy of aggressive attrition, which the Russians continue to follow. The meat grinder tactics, if you prefer. Pokrovsk is so important that the Ukrainians are obliged to defend it. In this instance, I don't think there is actually much choice for the Ukrainians other than to defend Pokrovsk for as long as possible. I'm usually someone who says that these defenses of undefendable places to the last man are counterproductive for Ukraine. But looking at the geography of Pokrovsk, I can't see that the Ukrainians have any realistic alternative other than to defend Pokrovsk itself, unless they make the decision to pull back entirely from Donbass, which perhaps is what they should do. But unless they're prepared to abandon the cities to the north, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinyvka, which clearly they're not prepared to do, they have to defend Pokrovsk. And that means feeding whatever men and machines they still have to try to hold Pokrovsk for as long as possible. And that, of course, works to the objective that the Russians have long since set themselves: aggressive attrition. The meat grinder tactics of grinding the Ukrainians down, openly discussed by General Surovikin, who was for a time Russia's overall commander back in the autumn of 2022, and which the Russians have at various levels of intensity pursued and conducted ever since. Anyway, we need to keep our minds clearly focused on Pokrovsk, because, as I said, this is clearly shaping into the great battle of the summer of 2025, of the Russian offensive. It does not mean that when Pokrovsk falls, the Russian offensive will end. On the contrary, in terms of territorial gains, it might be that the major gains will take place after Pokrovsk falls. But as was the case with Avdiivka in 2024, the capture of Pokrovsk will be like the pulling of the cork from the bottle. It will allow the Russian forces, if you like, to step through. There are no clear and obvious defense lines located north or indeed west of Pokrovsk to which the Ukrainians can fall back to, not until one eventually reaches the Dnieper. Just saying. Now, just to finish and complete about Pokrovsk. As I discussed, I think I was perhaps one of the very first people to mention the fact that Rodynska lies atop the main supply road to Pokrovsk from the north, and is therefore an obvious objective for the Russians. The Russians, if they capture Pokrovsk, would control 3 out of the main 4 supply roads to Pokrovsk. The remaining one leading to the west, leading ultimately to the city of Dnipro via Pavlograd. The E50 road is within relatively easy range of the Russian artillery. So, and of course the Russian drones. And frankly, if Rodynska is captured, and with the Russians already in control of Kotlino and Zvirove and probably Udachne before long, if not already, to the southwest of Pokrovsk, it seems to me that it's only a question of time anyway before the E50 road is also physically cut as well. And I would add that the road that leads to Pokrovsk from the north, the one that goes through Rodynska, is essentially already cut by the Russians, because if the Russians are shelling Rodynska as intensely as they are, and if their drones are already as busy on this road as they obviously are, it's impossible to believe that Ukrainian supplies can reach Pokrovsk through this road to any great degree. All that is left already, arguably, is the E50. If Rodynska falls, with the Russians already in control of Kotlino and Udachne, it's only a question of time before the E50, which is probably already a very dangerous road to use. Apparently, Russian drones operate over it on a regular basis, and it is already well within artillery range. But anyway, the E50 would very soon become essentially closed to all motor vehicle traffic as well. There would continue to be dirt roads leading into Pokrovsk, especially apparently from the north. Apparently, these dirt roads are already littered with the husks of burnt out Ukrainian vehicles, which have been tracked and destroyed by the Russian drones, just saying. So these dirt roads are already dangerous. If Rodynska were to fall, they would become more dangerous still. And though the garrison in Pokrovsk would probably be able to escape Pokrovsk, along these roads, the casualties would be extremely high. Anyway, that is the state of the battle of Pokrovsk as of today, according to the information which I have. All the reports speaking here of intensifying Russian pressure. Now, a little to the east, a similar battle is playing out in the area south of Konstantinyvka. And the New York Times has now published a piece which speaks about Ukrainian troops south of Konstantinyvka being in danger of encirclement. In my opinion, they have been largely encircled for some time already. There are again access routes to reach these Ukrainian troops, who are located in villages like Leonodivka, Sherbinovka, Katerinovka, Kleban-Bik, which have been widely talked about. But it looks as if even the ability to provide limited supplies to these troops, these Ukrainian troops who are there, is ending quickly. There are reports that the Russians have now captured an important and rather large village called Yablunovka, which is located to the west of this area, and that they're also in the process of storming and capturing the village of Alexandro Kalinova, which is also located in this area. There are even reports which say that advanced parties of Russian troops advancing from the west have now reached Katerinovka and Kleban-Bek, or at least the outskirts of these places. It looks as if any Ukrainian troops here are not just surrounded, but effectively trapped. And I think they have been trapped for some time. It's been possible to send a few supplies to them and to withdraw some people, but I suspect it's become already very dangerous, and I suspect that this battle south of Konstantinyvka is also rapidly coming to its end. Here, I'm going to say it straightforwardly, unlike Pokrovsk, I think the Ukrainians did have the option to withdraw, and to withdraw to better defense lines in Konstantinyvka itself. For reasons unknown, they chose not to do it. Well, I say on reasons unknown, because of Zelensky's obsessive stubbornness and his unwillingness to retreat even from the most undefendable places. They refused to retreat. And now, almost certainly, they are effectively trapped. And before long, they will be trapped to the point that we can justly talk about a cauldron. So these are the two big battles. There are lots of other battles going on across the conflict line. The Russians continue to maneuver and gain ground around Kupiansk and in the area of Liman. The Russians claimed about a week ago that there was actually street fighting going on inside Kupiansk, which, if true, may suggest that parts of the town are already contested. There are reports that the Ukrainians are themselves trying to prevent some of their forces from leaving Kupiansk, which may mean that the situation there is deteriorating as well. But these are reports that come from Russian sources, and I can't speak to their complete truth. The Russians have also crossed the border in several places, additional places in Kharkiv and in Sumy region. There are various claims that they now occupy the entire built-up area of Yunakovka in Sumy region. Now, there's no word to that effect from the Russian Defense Ministry, and this has sometimes been claimed, and those claims have turned out to be premature. There's also further claims that the Russians are now fighting well inside the Yuzhny micro-district in the area of Chasov Yar, the last micro-district in the wider Chasov Yar conurbation that the Ukrainians still control. Once the Yuzhny micro-district is captured by the Russians, it's confirmed, by the way, that they do control the Shevchenko micro-district, then the entire metropolitan area of Chasov Yar will have fallen finally under Russian control. And that, in my opinion, as I've discussed in previous programs, will be the end of the very complex series of battles that began in October 2022, leading to the capture of Soledar, Bakhmut, and eventually of Chasov Yar and of the surrounding towns and villages that are concentrated around these three locations. The Ukrainians, who I think have a much better understanding of the strategic significance of this territory of these places, of Solidar, Bakhmut, and Chasiv Yar, have again pulled out all the stops to resist the Russians here. The Russian operations in Chasiv Yar have been seriously complicated by the obstacle of the Seversky Donets aqueduct, the great pipeline, which it is difficult for their vehicles to cross and which has interfered with their logistics. And of course, they never really committed large numbers of troops to this area, their focus always having been in the area of Pokrovsk, Toretsk, and Konstantinyvka. But it does look finally, and indeed, as if this battle is coming to an end. And as I said, it's taken the Russians a very long time, but before long, certainly before the end of the summer, they'll be there. And the New York Times speaks of the entrapment of Ukrainian troops south of Konstantinyvka, the fall of Pokrovsk, and the consolidation of Russian control of Chasiv Yar, and by the way of significant stretches to the north of Chasiv Yar. And I don't just mean Chasiv Yar itself, but these outlying micro-districts will in turn lead to the encirclement, the effective encirclement of Konstantinyvka itself, and of course its collapse will lead to the rapid collapse, in my opinion, of the remainder of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation. It will become impossible for the Ukrainians to hold it also. So this is a mighty battle. It is playing out in western Donbass. The Russians are also advancing from western Donbass still towards the Dnieper. It's been pointed out that they're in the process of encircling the important fortified village of Novopavlivka, which is actually in Dnipropetrovsk region. But as I said, it is this area, this key area of Pokrovsk, Konstantinyvka, and ultimately Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, that the battle is taking place. And it's going to be the biggest, the most important and consequential battle of the war, at least so far, until the Russians reach the Dnieper and possibly the gates of Kiev itself again. Anyway, that's my summary of the military situation. There were, by the way, more missile and drone strikes by the Russians last night. Again, it's difficult for me to keep track on exactly what the Russians were attacking. There is a report that the Russians have increasingly managed to strike logistics routes, Ukrainian logistics routes. Back in 2022, it was quite clear that the Russians were uncertain of the exact location and movement of Ukrainian supply trains. And in fact, I remember for quite a long time, the Ukrainian official who was in charge of the Ukrainian railways was boasting that not a single train with equipment from the West, ammunition and logistics, was failing to get through. That is no longer the case anymore. Several trains have been destroyed apparently now en route. The Russians seem to have a fair idea of the warehouses where the equipment and ammunition that arrives from the West is located. I've received an email from a source with access to information inside Russia, I'm not going to say more, who says that the Russians believe that they are now destroying around a quarter of all air defense systems air defense interceptors, Patriots and such, that are sent to Ukraine in transit whilst they're on the trains before they reach the batteries, their various batteries located in and around Kiev. And it's not difficult to understand that, not only, almost certainly, how the Russians established a much deeper and denser intelligence operation inside Ukraine, but with their drones, their constant observation of movement in Ukraine, and with a clear understanding, a clearer picture of how the trains move and where the warehouses where the equipment is stored are located. The Russians are able to monitor the movement of the trains. They're able to deploy drones to attack them. And that is, of course, exactly and increasingly, it seems, what they are doing. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about Western equipment, military equipment supplies to Ukraine since that series of conversations that Donald Trump undertook at the beginning of this month. His conversation with Vladimir Putin on the 3rd of July, his follow-up conversations with Zelensky and Merz on the 4th of July. There have been other conversations and discussions involving various Western officials, and there's much speculation as to the extent and quantity of the military equipment that the West is currently sending to Ukraine. My own view is that it has dwindled significantly. Some equipment obviously continues to be sent. It looks as if Trump has relented on the previous decision of the Pentagon to pause deliveries of the remaining equipment authorized by President Biden in the last weeks of his presidency. There is still a certain amount of equipment from those authorizations that is still reaching Ukraine. But if we're talking about Patriot missiles, I'm going to say what I personally believe, which is that no Patriot missiles, apart perhaps from the 10 of the last batch, which was briefly paused, 10 out of the 30, that none of those are being sent, no more of those have been sent to Ukraine at all over the last couple of weeks. Bild Zeitung has published a rather interesting discussion about the state of deliveries of air defense missile deliveries to Ukraine. According to Bild Zeitung, Trump made crystal clear to Zelensky and Merz over the course of the conversations on the 4th of July that the United States is not prepared to donate any more Patriot missile systems out of its own exhausted inventories. Now, I mentioned this, by the way, at the time. I said that that was my understanding of what Trump had told Zelensky and Merz over the course of those calls. It looks as if that was indeed the case, that Trump said no more American Patriot missiles to Ukraine. Apparently, there is enormous pressure now on the various European countries that still have Patriot missiles to deliver Patriot missiles to Ukraine. Particular pressure apparently is being mounted on Switzerland, which it's important to remember is a neutral country, to start donating its Patriot missiles, because Switzerland is a neutral country and should not therefore be sending weapons systems directly to Ukraine. It is likely if they are sent at all, that they will be laundered through Germany. The Germans will buy them from the Swiss. The Swiss will supply them to Germany. Germany will then forward them to Ukraine. And the Swiss have already apparently placed orders for additional Patriot missiles from the United States, but it's widely acknowledged it will take them many years before any of these finally arrive. And of course, I'm sure that there are other countries across Europe where the pressure is similarly on. I'm not exactly sure which countries have Patriot missiles systems in Europe and which don't, but the pressure is on all of them to give up whatever they have. In other words, far from Europe rearming to face the Russians, it is continuing its accelerating process of disarming in order to try to save Ukraine. This is the bizarre paradox of this war, but it is playing out all the time. The Europeans have effectively given up their mobile artillery. All their self-propelled howitzers, or the greater part of them, have now been shipped off to Ukraine, where they've been mostly destroyed, or so it appears. There has been a certain uptick in production in France of Caesar howitzers, which have, by the way, not performed especially well in Ukraine. The Ukrainians complain that the gun barrels wear out very, very quickly because of the extremely high pressures. But anyway, put that aside. There's been a small uptick in production of Caesar howitzers, but in all other respects, things are as bad as always. And the Europeans have given up their artillery. They've given up a lot of their tanks. As we've seen, the Ukrainians have been provided with another batch of tanks, Abrams tanks, in fact, but this time from Australia. It's been explained to me, incidentally, that the Australians have basically decided that they don't need the Abrams, that this is a costly and expensive vehicle that really doesn't have any meaning, any logical meaning for their military any longer. The idea is that the Australian infantry, the Australian army, will transition towards lighter, more amphibious vehicles. And for that reason, it's possible now for Australia to give away all its tanks. But anyway, there are shortages of tanks. The United States doesn't seem at all keen on sending any more of its own tanks. Germany, as I said, has apparently no more of the Leopard 2s to give, and I'm not sure that it has any more of the Leopard 1s to give. Armoured vehicles altogether seem to be in extremely short supply. But anyway, all of this, and now they are going to get rid of all of their air defence missiles. In fact, I've also received another report which says that things have now reached the point that what is happening is that there's now a frantic attempt to create complete Patriot air defense missile interceptors by basically putting together stockpiles, the stores of spare parts, and combining them together to create completed missiles. And that this is happening, I suspect, not just in Europe, but in the United States as well. Now, that, of course, means that the arsenal of Patriot missiles becomes even more endangered. Because, as anybody knows, when dealing with complex equipment, you need spare parts because parts wear out. And if you've used all your spare parts in order to help someone else and have a shortage of spare parts of your own, then that is going to very, very quickly impact on the inventory of the equipment that you are using. Now, I speak again with some knowledge of this. I'm talking about commercial vehicles now, with which I did once upon a time, long ago, have some experience. I am sure that what is true of commercial vehicles is multiple times more true of the kind of sophisticated military equipment that we are talking about. So anyway, all of this is going on, and in the meantime, the Russians continue to crank out more drones. I saw that there was a report in Germany that says that it's a misconception that the Russians will, at some point in the next few months, be able to launch 1,000 Geran drones against Ukraine every night. A more accurate number would be 2,000 Geran drones every night. Well, if that is true, then obviously the air defense system, whatever it is, would become completely overwhelmed. And with the increasing sophistication and effectiveness of the Russian missiles, and the fact that the Ukrainians now apparently are using 4 missiles, air defense missiles, to try to shoot down any one, and I'm not talking about the hypersonic and more advanced ballistic missiles, but the less advanced ones. This is a game which the West can never hope to win. I would add that there has also been reports recently that the Russian fab bombs have, over the last few months, experienced a major leap in accuracy. That as the Russians use these bombs more and more, they've worked on them and made them more sophisticated and more resistant to jamming and more accurate when they strike targets. This, by the way, entirely contradicts an article that appeared in Forbes by David Axe some months ago. I've not seen anything of David Axe. Maybe he's gone his way. I'm not saying. I don't know. But anyway, an article by David Axe based on claims by a Russian blogger called Fighter Bomber, that the fabs were experiencing significantly reduced effectiveness because of the ubiquity of Ukrainian jamming. I remember covering that whole set of articles previously and expressing some skepticism about the claim. It turns out that the truth, again, is the diametric opposite. The fabs are becoming more sophisticated as well. There's 75,000 of them being churned off the Russian production lines every year now, and we're probably still not at peak production. And the Russian Air Force gets not so much bigger, but more sophisticated every month as more sophisticated aircraft replace older ones. Anyway, there it is. This is the military situation and the logistical and supply situation that is faced in the West. There is astonishingly little discussion of any of this in the West that I can see. You have to find the occasional article by people like Alex Vashinin, when he does get round to writing about it, to discuss this aspect of the war. But there continues to be a widespread reluctance to address this problem. Western officials, witness comments by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, are of course aware of it, but they don't seem to be willing or able to follow through with the logical conclusions that if the other side is outproducing you in weapons to the extent that it is doing, you cannot in the end hope to win this war. Now, a couple of days ago, about a week or so ago, reports appeared in the South China Morning Post talking about how Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, had supposedly told the High Representative for Foreign Policy of the European Union, Kaja Kallas, that China would not allow Russia to be defeated in Ukraine, because if Russia was defeated, China knew perfectly well that it would be next, that the Western powers would come after China just as they had previously come after Russia. Anyway, there is a further view which has been articulated by some commentators, notably Andrew Karibka, but which I suspect some people in the Pentagon perhaps quietly share, which is that from the Chinese point of view, not only are they not prepared to see Russia lose, but that the longer the war continues, they calculate, the better it is for them. And in the case of Andrew Karibka, he appears to think that there's actually a Chinese policy, if anything, to prolong the war. And the reason for this is absolutely simple, which is that even as the Chinese military build-up, which is, of course, being undertaken on a scale that absolutely dwarfs anything that the Russians are doing. Anyway, even as the Chinese military build-up in the Indo-Pacific region continues, the United States and the West continues to fritter away its resources to no good purpose in Ukraine, buying itself a few extra weeks with every dribble of weapons that it sends, depleting its arsenals even further. I don't believe that anybody in China, any member of the Chinese leadership, has made such a cynical calculation. I should say that straight away. This is not because the Chinese are not incredibly tough-minded and utterly ruthless strategists. It's that I don't believe that anybody in any government has the ability to think and plan in that kind of way. I think that people who assume that there are these very sophisticated plans being drawn up by particular governments overestimate the ability of governments to plan and prepare in that way. I think there is a general consensus in China that Russia cannot be allowed to lose. I think that consensus does exist. But I don't believe that anybody in China is actually planning or scheming to prolong the war in some way. Just saying. But by now, I think the Chinese undoubtedly are making that calculation. They are aware of the extraordinary diversion of resources by the West to the conflict in Ukraine and the effect that it is having on Western military inventories. And it is even extraordinary to hear how NATO generals, I believe an American general who serves in NATO, continues to talk up the importance of all of the NATO countries combining to confront the challenge from China. Apparently, a NATO general has just said that very thing, even whilst NATO continues to disarm itself by trying to arm Ukraine. It's most strange, and I'm going to suggest again that one shouldn't look too far for some kind of logic to this. It's just that there are different people within the Western military establishment pulling in different directions. So in the Pentagon, there are people like Elbridge Colby, probably the US Navy. My guess is the US Air Force as well. The people who would be tasked with confronting China if there was a Chinese operation against Taiwan or in the Indo-Pacific region. They are very disturbed and very horrified by the fact that already dwindling resources are being frittered away in pointless wars in Ukraine and, by the way, in the Middle East as well. But they run up against the generals in the Pentagon, in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and in the NATO commands, who've been very, very active over the last 3 years in Ukraine. We know, for example, that the summer 2023 offensive by the Ukrainians was largely commanded by NATO generals, General Cavalli and General Milley and others like that. And these people, those of them who are still in post, and most of them, of course, are still in post, they have a deep personal investment in this war. They were involved in this war. They don't want to see the war that they played such a big part in lost, and they will continue, therefore, to insist that Ukraine get all of the weapons that it can or that it wants to avert that evil day when the end finally comes. And given the structure of the bureaucracy in the United States, and given the enormous political pressure, especially in Europe, to keep the war going, to keep the United States committed to the war, it's very difficult for the administration to completely change course on this unless the president himself is fully committed to what you might call the Pete Hegseth, Elbridge Colby strategy of focusing exclusively on Ukraine. And the president obviously is not, because he obviously has different feelings about this. There's speculations that he's been leaned on by his wife. I think one should treat these claims very carefully. They appear to originate from Ukraine mostly, and to derive from a stray comment that the president made that he has a good conversation with Putin. Turns out that the White House tells the First Lady about the good conversation that he's just had with Putin, only to have the First Lady tell him that Putin is again attacking Kiev, and that sort of thing. Well, maybe she is exerting some influence over the president's decisions. I don't know. But anyway, she is, I suspect, the least of the problems. There is the Senate, there are the hardliners of the permanent state, there are all of these generals, and there is the president's own different complex feelings about this conflict. His inability to accept an American defeat, especially one in which he is now inevitably connected. His undoubted resentments towards the Russians and towards Putin, who are resisting his demands for a freezing of the conflict and for a ceasefire. And the president, because of all of these different pressures, is unable to make the clear choice that some people in the Pentagon would like him to do. Well, anyway, there it is. Now, speaking of all of this, the president did make his announcement about a week ago now, saying that the United States would sell weapons ultimately to Ukraine, paid for by the Europeans and supplied by NATO. And the president, of course, did threaten Russia with sanctions. And not just Russia with sanctions, but sanctions stroke tariffs against any country that continued to trade with Russia, certainly in energy products. If a completely arbitrary 50-day deadline that the president appeared to pluck out of the air was not honored by the Russians, with the Russians essentially capitulating and agreeing to the president's demand for a freezing of the conflict and for a ceasefire. So I and various others, Ian Proud is one case, Alex Christoforou on his channel is another, have pointed out that with this deadline, the president himself has put himself in an extremely difficult position. He has put himself in a trap where logically he's going to have to impose these massive tariffs on Russia's trading partners, on the Chinese in particular, if they continue to trade with Russia after that 50-day period has passed. And for the record, there's just been reports today that the Russian energy minister has in fact been in discussions with China about providing more oil and gas supplies to China. The report is in Interfax and it reads, Russian energy minister Sergei Tsivilev discussed oil and gas supplies to China with National Energy Administration head Wang Hongzhi, as well as the development of gas transportation infrastructure during his 2-day visit to the country. The Energy Ministry, that's the Russian energy industry, said in a statement. Agreements were reached to promote a number of joint industry initiatives and deepen coordination in various international venues. The Russian minister held talks with the heads of Chinese Oil and Gas Corporation, CNPC, and Engineering Corporation, CEEC. That looks to me, by the way, as if we're looking at discussions here, detailed discussions about how to complete the development of the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. But of course, you could also say that this is two fingers at Donald Trump and the United States. The Russians and the Chinese continue to collaborate on joint energy projects in complete defiance of Donald Trump's ultimatum. And as I and many others have pointed out, the United States is in a weak position with respect to its ultimatum. The Chinese have tightened export controls on rare earths over the last couple of weeks, even as they've relaxed the restrictions on their supply, something that they did following the agreements that they reached with the Americans in Geneva and in London a few weeks ago. There are reports that the Chinese authorities have been acting to close down and round up any Chinese groups and companies that might be engaged potentially in an illicit trade in rare earths to the United States. And the reports say, and I'm getting this from the Chinese media, that this clampdown has been effective and that the illicit trade in rare earths, which can never have been very large, has essentially come to a total stop. So the United States is in a weak position to impose 100% tariffs against China and invite Chinese retaliation. And frankly, I don't believe that is going to happen. And I think that the president himself understands this very well. And there continues to be all kinds of speculations, therefore, about his motives in asserting that 50-day ultimatum, the one which he gave. Now, briefly, before I continue, I will say that, in my opinion, it had no other purpose than to buy the president time to avoid a crisis during the summer, which might have happened if Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal had managed to get their bill through Congress and their bone-crushing sanctions bill, which required 500% tariffs from countries like China that continued to trade with Russia, mandating this by law and requiring the president to make any decisions, either to relax sanctions like that, subject to oversight by Congress. And I think that the president did not want to be stuck in this through the summer, so he gave his ultimatum, basically, so that he could give himself time during the summer. People who are often under extreme stress, I've seen this in legal contexts many, many times, do this. They buy themselves time without really having much plan about what they're going to do with the time. They give themselves 30 days here or 50 days there. They hope that something during that period will turn up. And even if it doesn't, they have a rest. They can rest during that period. They can relax, or at least for some of that period, they can let their tension levels fall. It puts them in a stronger position, or so they believe, and they hope and believe that at the end of this period of time that they have bought themselves, things will get easier for them again, and they'll be able to come up with something else which will enable them to kick the can down the road months more. I've seen it happen many times in litigation. This is extremely common. It rarely works out in the end, but as I said, I won't say that I haven't seen it done. On the contrary, I've seen it done very often. And by the way, the president is showing signs of stress. There's been some reports recently of physical symptoms that he has been suffering from, bruisings, which sound more like swellings, symptoms which, to me, could suggest somebody who is experiencing very severe levels of stress and tension. Again, I speak with experience here. I've seen that happen. And, well, you have further examples of this in the incredibly bad-tempered comments that the president has made against his own supporters in connection with his decisions, or rather the decisions his administration has taken relating to, shall we say, the scandal surrounding a certain financier. I'm being very careful, obviously, what I say, but I know all of you, of course, know fully what I'm talking about. Very few people have pointed out how disastrously badly this affair has been how disastrously badly this affair has been handled. Even if the president wanted to do what he has done and had reasons to do it, he could have handled it far more skillfully, and there are people around him who could have helped him do that. The fact that it has been as badly handled as it has been, that he has said things which I can't imagine he doesn't now regret saying. and writing things which I'm sure he must regret even more. Well, and he's also, by the way, brought a court case which, though I agree with him on the facts of what happened, which led him to bring the court case, I think in itself it is misconceived. It's going to turn Rupert Murdoch, the infamous press baron, if I can call him like that, who he's now suing, it's going to harden attitudes on the part of this person against him. Anyway, all of this, to me, speaks of somebody who is under very, very great stress. And I think that this is going to play out with more signs of further stress over the course of the summer and the early autumn as well, and increasingly erratic decision making too. The president, for example, has now made further threatening statements against Iran. I have already discussed, and we have also discussed in our programs on the Duran, how the 12-day war against Iran was a massive strategic mistake, how it has caused the United States to lose track of the future development of Iran's nuclear enrichment program. The president apparently expected that after the 12-day war and the attacks on the Iranian nuclear facilities, the Iranians would return immediately to the negotiations and would be pressured to do so by the Chinese and the Russians. He shows every sign of being dismayed by the fact that the Iranians are refusing to do that, that they're demanding guarantees that if they do resume the negotiations, the United States and Israel will not attack them again. As I discussed in my program yesterday, an Iranian official, when asked to explain what those guarantees were, spoke about punishment for Israel for its temerity in attacking Iran during the negotiations and compensation paid to Iran for the damage that was done. And the Iranian official, seemed to understand that these are all politically impossible, but he said that this was a problem for the United States now, not for Iran, and that if the United States is not able to give these guarantees, Iran will act on the assumption that it does not have good faith in the negotiations and will not engage the United States in negotiations, and will therefore continue to prepare for the resumption of the conflict which the Iranians assume is inevitable. And none of that seems to have been the president's expectations, and he's now angrily said that if the Iranians rebuild their nuclear facilities, he will bomb them to oblivion again, which, by the way, commits him to attacking Iran, even if the Iranians conduct repair work to the facilities, regardless of whether they've taken any further steps with respect to enriching uranium or towards acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. So, the president, again, making a comment which, if he takes a step back and thinks it through, he should perhaps realize was unwise, but which, now that he said it, he can't row back. So, what I suspect we're starting to see is a return to trying to get negotiations with Russia and Iran back on track in order to get the president out of the two traps, the one with Russia and the other with Iran, that he has walked into. So, Zelensky conducted his reshuffle. It was his intention, apparently, in fact, it was made fairly clear that it was his intention, to send the former defense minister, Rustem Umerov, to the United States as ambassador. Zelensky has made a succession of comments in recent days and weeks saying that the Istanbul process is exhausted and that it cannot lead anywhere, and that the only way forward is for direct negotiations to take place between him, that is to say Zelensky, and the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, with the objective, the only objective, being to freeze the conflict on the existing conflict lines. And I've said in many programs that I don't expect Zelensky ever to resign from that position, and I don't believe that he ever will do. Well, suddenly, and to everybody's surprise, including to the Russians' surprise, yesterday he suddenly announced that the negotiations in Istanbul will resume next week. The Russians have been completely blindsided by this. They say that this is a public statement by Zelensky. No one on the Ukrainian side contacted them and told them that Zelensky was interested in resuming the discussions in Istanbul. Of course, they are happy to resume those discussions, but there's no doubt at all that they're surprised, as indeed I am, by this sudden reversal on Zelensky's part. And the explanation actually isn't difficult, because though all of the signals were that Umerov would be sent to the United States as ambassador, Umerov was not sent to the United States as ambassador. He was instead appointed Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, a position which in some respects is senior to that of Defense Minister. But that, it seems, was not the plan. The original plan was indeed to send him to the United States as ambassador. The reports in Ukraine say that it was the Americans who objected. It was the United States that said they do not want Umerov in Washington, D.C. They want him to remain in Kiev. And it's not difficult to see why. Because Umerov is not just, or was not just, Ukraine's defense minister. He is also Ukraine's chief negotiator in the negotiations with the Russians. And the assumption is that if he had gone to the United States as ambassador, he would not be able to remain chief negotiator. He would have to be either replaced by someone else, or the entire negotiation process would have to be scrapped. But of course, if he stays in Kiev, if he remains Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, nothing prevents him remaining Ukraine's chief negotiator. And Zelensky was careful in his announcement to confirm that it was actually Umerov who proposed the follow-up meeting in Istanbul next week. So it looks as if Umerov will be leading again the Ukrainian delegation, and if the Americans are insisting that he remain in Kiev, it's likely that Umerov and the Americans have been in contact, and the Americans have been telling Zelensky and Umerov that they do want the negotiations in Istanbul to proceed, and they want Umerov to lead them again. And given this demand from Washington, Zelensky really is in no position, given the realities of the situation on the front lines, to say no. So this is, I think, what has happened. Now, there continues to be all sorts of other speculations about the 50-day time that Trump supposedly has given the Russians to agree the deal and to sign on the dotted line and to agree to the freeze of the conflict within 50 days. Various commentators are suggesting now that the Trump White House is trying to get Zelensky removed from his post. I discussed yesterday in my program the article to that effect by Seymour Hersh. I explained why I had grave doubts about that article, but it is undoubtedly the case that more and more articles have appeared in the media in the West, extremely critical of Zelensky over the last few weeks. I spoke about an article that has appeared in The Spectator by Owen Matthews, talking about how the Ukrainian people have lost all belief in Zelensky. And a lot of people are putting all of this together and are saying that there's clearly an organized campaign to get rid of Zelensky, and they are assuming that the Americans are behind it. I don't think this is the case myself. I think that these articles, which have been appearing, simply reflect the increasing deterioration, the rapidly deteriorating situation in Ukraine. I don't believe that there is any intention in the Trump White House to remove Zelensky at this time. There is no statements or comments from any US official that I am aware of that suggest a plan to remove Zelensky. There is, of course, always criticism in Kiev from former President Petro Poroshenko and his circle of Zelensky. This has been a constant in Ukrainian politics for at least a year now, in fact longer than a year. But I think that the loss of confidence in Zelensky on the part of the wider Ukrainian public is completely unrelated to this. And I also think it is completely unrelated to the various articles that have appeared, to the reshuffle in Kiev, and to the speculations and to the general mood in Ukraine, which, as I said, is being driven by the events in the war. My own view is that, on the contrary, the reshuffle demonstrated the strength of Zelensky's position. He's been able to move even more hardline and loyal figures into more positions of power. I don't sense that there is any danger at the moment that he or his chief of staff, Yermak, will lose control. I don't think the Americans are seeking to remove Zelensky or any of those things. That's my reading of the situation. I think that Zelensky has no belief or conviction in the negotiations in Istanbul. He's made that clear many, many times. but at a time when the military situation on the battlefields is becoming critical to the point of catastrophic, when there's already a huge question mark over American military aid, when military aid from Europe is falling short, I think Zelensky understands that he is not in a position to defy Trump or the Americans when they demand a resumption of the negotiations in Istanbul and when they demand that Umerov continues to lead the Ukrainian delegation. Now, I see no sign or hint on the Russian side that they're prepared to make any compromises at all. So another meeting will take place in Istanbul next week. The two sides will exchange views. I doubt that it will come to more than that. Prisoner exchanges have been continuing, but I suspect the rate of that is going to start to dwindle. But at least it provides Donald Trump with an argument, perhaps, when his ultimatum expires, that it's too soon to impose the 100-day tariffs, the 50-day tariffs, because the parties are still in discussion and are still negotiating, and that it would be a mistake for the United States to take action which might cause those negotiations to break down. So I think that this move that we're seeing almost certainly is connected more with that event, the president trying to get out of his 50-day ultimatum, than with anything else. That's the first thing I'm going to say. Now, on the other separate negotiation, the one with Iran, negotiations between the United States and Iran are at an impasse. The Iranians are not prepared to negotiate. An attempt is underway, therefore, to get talks underway about Iran's nuclear enrichment program, organized between Iran and Europe. And apparently there's going to be a meeting, presumably by Arakshi, with Arakshi representing the Iranians, and European officials from France, Germany, and Britain at some point over the next couple of days or weeks. I don't think that the Europeans, however, are going to find the Iranians in any kind of conciliatory mood. There are reports, which no one can confirm, by the way, that Iran has imported air defense missiles from China. They may very well be true, but nothing definite and concrete that will confirm that. And besides, as Brian Beletic has pointed out many times, simply supplying missiles and batteries and radars doesn't mean that a proper air defense system has been created and is in a position to function. And in practical terms, the fact that those Chinese missiles might be in Iran doesn't mean that they are active and that they represent a convincing air defense system at this point of time. But it is highly likely that the Iranians are indeed taking steps to strengthen their defenses. It's gone entirely unnoticed that even as there's been a lot of speculation and discussion about Iran buying weapons from China, there's been what look like increasingly regular flights by the Russian air transport fleet, Ilyushin 76 flights to Iran. Of course, nobody knows what those flights are carrying or who is on them. But we do know that there's been an exercise, a naval exercise by the Iranian and Russian navies in the Caspian Sea, a joint naval exercise in the Caspian Sea. And both the Russian and Iranian governments have just released a confirmation that the Russian-Iranian Strategic Partnership Treaty is now active. So it does look as if the Iranians are now starting to take steps to beef up their defenses, probably, and to tighten their relations with their friends. So we're probably going to have a meeting in Istanbul between the Russians and the Ukrainians next week. Nobody, I think, should expect any breakthroughs. And we are likely to have a meeting between the Europeans and the Iranians maybe next week. And again, no one should expect any breakthroughs. But in the meantime, the Russians continue to pile up the pressure in Pokrovsk and Konstantinyvka, and there's some evidence that the Iranians are taking steps to beef up their defenses. Meanwhile, and just to round off this video, there continues to be fighting in southern Syria between the Druze and various Arab militia. I notice how parts of the media in Britain have talked about the militia, which is clearly connected to al-Jalani's movement, that is fighting the Druze. It's been referred to as Bedouin, which is, it demonstrates again the extraordinary contortions that some people are continuing to undertake rather than face the reality of a Syria that is spiraling downward into a state of collapse. There's been an interesting article that has appeared in the British media, incidentally, talking about the terrible state within Syria of Syrian minorities, how they face active persecution by the dominant authorities in Syria today. There's references to the Druze, to the Christians, to the Alawites. What did people expect? Why did they assume that those sort of things wouldn't happen if al-Jalani's movement gained power in Syria? There's been endless numbers of warnings that if a jihadi movement were to gain power in Damascus, exactly what we are seeing would happen. It's incredible that those who claim, some of those who now claim to lament what is taking place, still refuse to acknowledge that their incessant demands for regime change in Syria have led precisely to this outcome. To repeat again what I have said many times, the situation in Syria is dark and growing darker. I myself believe that we are looking at a process of collapse, which is probably going to accelerate over the next few weeks. If the Druze successfully resist, other Syrian communities will do so also. I suspect that there is little unity within the Sunni community in Syria either. We're looking at the death throes of a state. Anyway, This is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.